Welcome. Our colloquium speaker is Brandon Brown from University of San Francisco, where he's currently the department chair of the physics department. Brandon did his PhD in superconductivity, actually vortex dynamics of superconductors at Oregon State University. He did some of his postdoc time in science communication at UC Santa Cruz. And when he joined the University of San Francisco, he switched his research field to sensory biophysics, which he's done a lot of work in. And in fact, he's currently teaching a class on that to general student group. And then he's also told me that his next book project is related to sensory biophysics, or is about that. He's the author of 3 books so far. First one, Max Planck, Driven by Vision, Broken by War. And his second book is The Apollo Chronicles, about the NASA moon program. And then his third book, which he'll be telling us, speaking to today, is Sharing Our Science, How to Write and Speak STEM. He's a recipient of several awards from his university and several awards for his book about Planck. And he was a distinguished lecturer at the Clinton School for Public Service, speaking about the Apollo Chronicles book. He's somebody I met, by the way, when I was at a program at the Kavli Institute in Santa Barbara, where he was like a writer in residence, science writer in residence. He's a great guy to talk to, and I'm glad he agreed to come tell us about this. I think he said this is the 12th talk he's given on this topic, and he's just about had it. So we got in just before the end. And thank you for coming, Brandon.
Here we go. Thanks, Ted. Testing. We all right here?
Yep, it's good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is a little graphic from the book. And indeed, as one reviewer of the book said, a lot of the graphics in today's talk are eye candy, like the ones in the book, but the messages aren't. I've really trying to distill something for you to where everyone can walk away, hopefully with something actionable and useful. I do, believe me, alter this talk for my audience a little bit every time, and I encourage you to do the same. And by the way, I think if you see the title of the talk, I think most of us assume if we're communicating science, you mean to the general public or outside our research silo. And I'm hoping to talk about universal concepts that would benefit you on inter-department or inter-research group emails, cover letters to journals, grant proposals, and papers, etc. So I'm not specifically interested in communicating science to the general public. There's a lot of people working on that. I thought, University of Maryland, I've always wanted to visit the campus. I'm really happy to be here. I attended a similar land-grant college at Oregon State University with a similar founding year. And when I was at Oregon State University, we got our samples from you all here in the department. What was then the Center for Superconductivity Research, you all started that at this university right after the Nobel Prize in high temperature superconductivity in '87, when I was really cutting my teeth in physics. And then I went to grad school somewhat later and started these kind of projects. And from what I understand, this has gone through evolutions and mergers here, and you still have a center related to that old thing founded in 1988, which is the Quantum Materials Center, founded just before the pandemic. Kind of interesting. All right, that was apropos of nothing, but we're going to get down to the script, and we're going to start with, I like to promise, I think this talk actually gets more and more interesting, but we're going to talk at an important and often overlooked scale, the sentence scale. There's some basics on craft, and I'm honing those parts for scientific sentences for sure, but then we'll want to talk about a couple of common modes of our communication that are worth dissecting. And the most fun part, I believe, is talking about how we communicate to one another as primates. As Ted mentioned, I was a writer in residence at KITP near Santa Barbara. And the idea of my immersing myself, I'm an experimentalist by trade for sure, but the idea of me immersing myself with theorists doing quantum gravity and string theory, there were kind of two parallel sessions at the time. I was really interested in a project called Brain versus Physics, which is sort of what do we know about the evolved brain and what it really evolved to do, and versus what do we hope to accomplish with theoretical physics and unified theory, et cetera. We're not going to go into that, but I found some interesting pockets of research on brain evolution that I think are super relevant to the ways we communicate and might challenge some of our assumptions, for better or worse. And brief notes on talks. And hopefully I mostly walk the walk, although there's a lot of text in this talk, of course. So we'll start with craft. I'm telling you two anecdotes that are kind of the tent poles of the talk today, and I'm doing that for a reason we'll discuss later. I was an undergraduate at Rice University, and I had a roommate who was an English major who talked me into taking a creative writing class. I wasn't initially interested, but I would literally walk like across this quadrangle, almost literally that path there and back, and I really ended up kind of liking fiction writing. My fiction's terrible. I mercifully don't write any of that for the world. I do love nonfiction. But in these workshops, we had one very interesting set of rules. And then I would go, I had a research project at the time with Thomas Estell of Morris, Estell and Lane quantum book. I was writing up some research review stuff for him. And there was one way of writing over in the physics building, and then this very different way of writing when I was studying with a fiction writer across the way. And I never really questioned that. But on one side, on the sort of right side of this diagram, there was an obsession with where is the reader? Why is the reader reading this second paragraph of your document? What about the first paragraph or the first sentence compels them? What can you do to be sympathetic to them and their attention span, et cetera? And on the back on the other side, when I'm writing up stuff for Professor Estell and writing my lab reports, et cetera, there's just this assumption that everyone in the audience is compelled to read it all, or they have no choice. And we often write accordingly, right? So in my first book, I wrote a whole version of the Max Planck story in a traditional biographical format, sort of birth to death. I'm still fascinated by Max Planck because he was someone who could change his mind, which is rare enough. But I shared it to some trusted readers, including my wife, a biologist, and she said, "This is fine, but it's really dull. It's really hard going." And indeed, the first part of Planck's life, there was just no tension, if you will, right? There's no narrative there other than, oh, he had a privileged Prussian background, very comfortable. Was superseded oftentimes by Heinrich Hertz early in his career, getting the physics jobs, but not a lot to compel a reader from paragraph to paragraph. So I threw out a whole draft, literally, didn't keep any sentences, and wrote what eventually became the book, which kind of starts very close to this photograph. He's writing a letter directly to Adolf Hitler, pleading for the life of his son, who was arrested in the German resistance. And we delve way, way into the physics, et cetera. But there's a little bit of a hook of, is he going to be able to rescue his son? Now, I'm not saying we can do our research papers and grant proposals exactly on that kind of model, but we often bury the lead. There is something compelling for our readership about our scientific stories, but we don't often surface it close enough to the beginning of our documents or talks even, et cetera. So we can usually find things like, depending on your field, maybe not in black hole thermodynamics, but the stakes to human interest. And maybe that's going to be easier for our biological scientists. Human readers, especially those sympathetic to science, love a mystery. Like, we have no idea why this process happens the way it does, or why we're finding the data we're finding. Admitting that, actually using question marks, I like to tell people I work with, in subheadings, et cetera, in titles, is super compelling. People who are already coming to science with some interest love question marks. A surprise, as you know, is often great. When I was cutting my teeth scientifically, we didn't expect many stars to have planets, and we found so much in that regard, which has been delightful. But there's one more that's of use to all of your scientific stories, I would say, and it's I had a fiction instructor when I went to Oregon State University, I should say. I was still doing this, let's take a few writing workshops on this side of campus and do my physics work on this side. It's literally why I went to Oregon State University versus some other programs that said, no, you're never leaving the physics building. Oregon State said I could go take something in chemistry or writing if I wanted. I still never questioned that dichotomy, and I didn't start trying to port some of the lessons from writing fiction or narrative nonfiction into physics until I started writing grant proposals, and I started really thinking about, oh man, there's some, at that time, there's some reviewer in a hotel near the NSF with just a huge 15 document thick stack of grant proposals, and if I sympathize with them, try to engage them, that might help, and I do think it helped. But what we all have, this one fiction instructor I had said, all the plots have already been told, and maybe in the great religious texts or whatever. It's not like you're going to invent a new plot. What you need to engage any reader is usually a character, someone with a goal encountering an obstacle, and the whole story is how do they deal with that and try to get towards their goal. For us, it doesn't need to be a character. The goal could be a process, a theory, etc. And in the second book, that was super fun. In the Apollo book, my book is the astronauts are just kind of inconvenient, delicate payload. The book's all about the engineers solving problems. But boy, they had so many clear goals and so many obstacles that had never been encountered before. That was a lot of fun, but what drove that narrative, okay? All right, so, and talking about burying the lead, your readers are very smart, and they can handle an early reveal of, you know, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and here's the main problem, the main thing we're trying to solve. And I think the readers are automatically more engaged. Okay, so this, I'm warning you, when my mom saw an early version of the book, she used to teach English and said, don't take people back to grammar class, so we're going to avoid that. But I do want to get into this sentence level. Now, there is a dichotomy. When we write about something challenging, I think the natural reaction is, I'm going to add words, I'm going to make it more complicated, I'll repeat myself, etc. And that makes my text more clear, or that makes my teaching presentation more clear. There's a reality, though, that the more concise things get, the greater the audience's cognition and retention go up. If you don't mind this vague percentage here, this is based on a lot of cognitive studies, and it's kind of an old saw here. So editing and trying to contract things where possible is super important, and I do think it's counterintuitive. So I only have 2 examples. They're really quick just to get you thinking about these things. And by the way, if you've turned over a lot of your writing to ChatGPT, other large language models, I'm definitely going to reference that and why you should proceed maybe with caution. Here's a good one maybe from my old days, trying to build a magnet from scratch. Right? We talk like this a lot, or especially scientifically we write like this. It was discouraging to discover the new magnet's lack of reliability. Now, as a writer, we do write this way a lot, but as an editor, I would say key on this, where if we're a storytelling species, subjects and verbs are super important. I try to get my students away from vague, unmoored pronouns. This, that, it. It is literally Nothing here. It is sort of referencing a feeling or a basis state for the mind encountering the experiment. Now, the being verbs was, is, are, they come very naturally out of our typing fingers. I like to call them the microwave ovens of verbs. They'll kind of do the job for you, but they are usually a missed opportunity. So I want to make it clear from the start, am I advocating going into your, I was talking with one of you earlier today about a 50-page paper that's having hitting some speed bumps under review. In no way anyone has time for anything I'm talking about for every sentence in any kind of long document, but the key and the abstract, cover letter, heaven forbid a press release, which we've talked about a little bit today as well. It's really worth your time. So English, compared to other languages, has a virtual plenty of verbs. And they can do a lot of work for you and engage your audience. And that is, if you take one thing out of the talk and you want to look at your sentences, your emails, etc., think about your verbs. And the being verbs are usually a wasted opportunity. It was. That's a subject and verb in this sentence, okay? Let's take another run at that. So what could we do? Let's have a natural subject, a new magnet, and it could do something like exhibiting. That's an accurate verb, a discouraging lack of reliability. If we really look for the right verb, it often can tell part of the story, and we have fewer words yet. It overheated, it had some problem with its, maybe a pinch point in its critical current density. It overheated during its first test. I'm advocating things like that. Okay, so think of a good, intentional, clear subject instead of a vague one. Try to choose a good verb that does a lot of the lifting of what you're trying to explain to your audience, and they'll understand things better already. A big one scientifically, though, is what the writer Zenser calls clutter. I love this word for writing. Here's an example of a scientific sentence. Heaven forbid we don't have to read it precisely. It has maybe 7 or 8 prepositional phrases. It's fine enough. I think it has a problem with which and that. It does. It's a temperature that separates, okay? So it has a little writing problem already. That's me in the late 90s with one of my PRB papers, right? And my note about large language models is they are feasting on sentences like these. So if we want to use ChatGPT to write science, it's going to create a lot of output like this, truly. And that's fine. First thing is I think these bots are really great editors, and I really advocate using them for that. They're great summarizers. I was talking at lunch with a few of you. It was a really fun conversation, but there's new research out showing if you just let one of these bots write the abstract to a scientific paper, it has the paper only to work with, and it writes the abstract, it does such a job that research scientists can't, within a sigma, tell which abstracts are written by humans and which ones by bots. So they're great summarizers. If you want to feed it a research paper and ask for a little summary, it might do well. Creating from scratch, though, it is going to be writing a lot of sentences like this, and oops, use the right keyboard. I'm going to reference a writer a couple times today named Francine Prose, a great teacher of writer, a great writer in her own right. Has a couple of books on writing that I really advocate. But she says consider sentences like tightropes for your readers, and the longer these sentences get, the more people are going to fall off on either side and lose interest in your story. So how do you reduce clutter? What we do in a lot of sentences, especially when we're trying to be clear, we start with what I call a wind-up with a reference to baseball pitching. This sort of extra verbiage, which often isn't doing much. One of my favorites is that we see scientifically, it is well understood that to begin a paper, right? So you either have offended part of the audience who don't agree with the first statement, or you're set everyone else back. Like, okay, the first part is dull. We do a lot of obviousness trying to be clear. In this experiment, you can find that over and over when it's clearly in an experimental physics paper, a grant proposal. Tons of prepositional phrases, and we need them. Like the sentence I was joking with myself about from high TC, I needed to say at low magnetic fields or whatever, at these current densities. They help us specify. However, I've come to think of them like a washboard in an old dirt road that's been through too many rainstorms, or like a bunch of speed bumps. When there's too many one after the other, I think we lose readers along the way. It's jarring to their teeth. And verb piles, compared to other kinds of writing, even other kinds of academic writing, we do what I like to call verb piles. It's funny, I was talking to someone today too, about scientific humility, and that might be a problem in academic science, and how we need to promote ourselves to get ahead and get people to reference our work and see the work, etc. The one place where, especially in physics, I think that we're humble is in our sentences. There's often a lot of trying or attempting, and like we know science is hard, and these extra words kind of keep us from the main verb. So if you see a bunch of verbs with to in between them, there's sometimes you could just get to one verb, and I'll show you an example or two of that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, and then we're done with the dry part of the talk completely. This is almost literally from a sentence I was helping someone with in the biotech sector. And so let's look for wasted text. The beginning and the ending, I would say, are things we don't need. See, the idea behind this process is that you can lose all of that, arguably. And I love this. This is what tons of biology or medical writing has: in perspective patience. You keep assuring people that you're not going to be injecting people at bus stations at random with whatever drug you're studying. Otherwise, there are some non-ideal verbs. We maybe wasted some verb opportunities. There it is: be able to metabolize. We could just metabolize. And there's another being verb, will be. And we've repeated cancer cells. If we're a little more efficient with our verbiage, can we write something like this? And maybe there aren't as many biologists in this audience today, so I can get away with this summary. But here, I'm highlighting subjects and verbs again, right? The enzymes activate, and it's just telling more of your story. That's kind of an extreme version of reducing text. These are the kind of things I advocate in parts of the book. And the reason I think it's had some good reviews is editors of research journals like to see someone advocating for this kind of editing before they see the papers. So they've liked chapter 5, which I think is relatively the dry stuff. Just some words of wisdom for better writers than myself. I love Toni Morrison's writing. But this, I think, I like to take Toni Morrison's words here as advocating editing. For the key parts of your writing or your talks, what can you cut out? More about this visually later. And one of my favorite writers, actually trained in geophysics originally before becoming a very successful novelist and nonfiction writer, George Saunders, says you really need to think anytime you're writing or communicating, try to think about a Q&A. If someone's interested, you're raising questions in the reader's mind and understanding which questions will arise before they, slightly before they would be asking them, and then giving them just enough answer to lead to the next question. If you ever suffer, like I've got a big project and you have writer's block, I think writing yourself it's just an informal Q&A, nothing you may use, maybe you'd use some of it, but write a Q&A with a prospective audience member. You could make them cynical or uninformed or funny, just to get yourself writing if you suffer from writer's block. Okay, other than trying to choose a good verb and using the huge number of verbs at your beck and call in the English language, the second piece I hope you could take away with you just on fundamental writing anyway is from Francine Prose, would you say it that way? You read stuff aloud and it will call out to you if it's too unnatural, and for readers that matters. there's kind of that reading voice in mind, and the more it sounds like another human being talking to them, the more likely they are to engage with it and pay attention to the text, right? The way I was not asked to lunch today is the way we might write about it scientifically, right? It would look like this. Now, of note here, what is this form? It is suggestive. We write like this a lot, and I want to talk about so-called passive voice. In the next part of the talk, then, we're going to go into common modes of scientific communication. One version, different version of this, I gave a much longer workshop to a public outreach effort, nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area called Wonderfest. And the director of that program said, I want you to do a writing workshop, and if nothing else, I want you to get them to never write in passive voice again. And I don't agree with that. So that none of you have to, I've done a deep dive into linguistics and cognitive research on passive voice, and there's some interesting nuggets to pull out. So now we're going to talk about some common modes. We're getting away from sentences per se. What is active versus passive voice? It's fine if you don't recognize that. You've heard it, but you're not quite sure. It's sort of active has a very clear subject and doer of some activity. Our analysis found, the analysis is what found flame retardants. I've worked with a group in the Bay Area called the Green Science Policy Institute to help amplify their important messages. They use research chemistry to inform safer consumer products. We have a lot of flame retardants that are very bad for us in our cars. So try not to eat in your car. I know it's hard in modern life. So that's an active sentence. We're very familiar with this, right? Flame retardants, that's a subject, but they were found. We don't know who found them. They were found in some, that's a passive version of the sentence. Why does that matter? Why are writers on about active versus passive voice? We see it in science a ton, I think. It makes sense. It broadcasts objectivity. It doesn't matter who looked for the flame retardants. Anyone who did it competently would have found X% in these foam samples, right? It's sort of a universality. It's useful, okay? Passive voice, though, it's about, compared to other academic writing and other writing of all stripes, it's much more prevalent. It's more than a third of our sentences in general are in passive voice, where you can't tell who's doing what. Fine. Cognitively, it creates a distance between the reader and the writer. And I think that also could be good scientifically, especially if you want objectivity. You don't want it to matter like exactly who you are, what university you're from, etc. You want people focused on the issue. So that could be good. It also disconnects a reader's emotions from the topic. So if you're a professional writer, you don't want that. You want to engage people's emotions. You want the reader pulled in towards the text. So the professional writers like journalists, fiction writers, novelists, etc., they will really tell you not to use passive voice. Here's what we should think about, I think. So I would avoid it if you're doing outreach, something for the public. Really the first couple of paragraphs of a grant proposal. Definitely in fundraising material. Even grant proposals, you could minimize it a little bit, I think. When I've been an administrator at time, or when I'm a department chair, I found great uses of passive voice even recently, after I did kind of a deep dive of what linguists think of the passive voice. I've been using it more in feedback or for conflict-prone situations, and literally kind of taking that actor out of these important sentences in some email is sort of the opposite of escalating. It really can calm a situation down. I did this not too long ago. Some very old biophysics research we had published. We looked at some literally materials physics collected from some exotic animals that detect electric fields. It's very hard to find just the right place to publish this where anyone who would care would find it. So someone did some similar data on some hydrogels recently, and I literally wrote an email like this. They said passive voice. I didn't say who published it. I included a bunch of links, including stuff to our lab, but other labs as well. We went on to have a kind of great dialogue on this, but we might be tempted to write it in active voice, right? My lab published this stuff, you should cite us. And that is not as calming, not as useful. So I'm not a big proponent of avoiding passive voice. It does project objectivity. It's really good if you're expecting some conflict. I have heard people, like some postdocs contacted me after I visited Fred Hutch in Seattle and said they went right and rewrote some emails, and we're glad they did. But think about it for that. And again, early in a grant proposal, we want to try to have a little more active voice, and it will keep your readers moving closer to the text along the way. All right? Okay, one we've all heard about and been hit over the head with, but especially for communicating with the general public, is acronyms, right? And I kind of like to think of these almost like, especially some of you are maybe early in your career. And I remember being in graduate school, and the first time I was able to hit all the semantic milestones of flux vortex dynamics and vortex phase transitions, etc. And it felt a little bit like a merit badge that I was wearing to join the club, right? But every time you're creating a new, smaller inclusivity, you're excluding other people who might want to know the story. Interestingly, if you believe the research literature on this, it's not just a general public issue. Nobody really likes a ton of highly, highly specific language. If you track the verbal complexity of a research publication, and you can do this, there are automated things like SMOG, semantic measure of gobbledygook, that was created, that's really its title, created in the 60s. It kind of measures the grade level of some chunk of text you feed it. But if you track that versus downloads and citations, etc., there is a statistically significant cost to having complicated language, even for your research colleagues citing and downloading your work. Something to think about, especially for things like abstracts. So what can you do when you've got to use a lot of highly specific language? One thing I like to do is depending on the length of the document, is give myself a quota. How many tech terms am I really going to try to teach to an audience? I like to give simple nicknames, and I don't mean like a playful nickname necessarily, although I've called the, like a Raja Levis, the barn door skate, pancake-like predator. But no, simple nicknames like, once a reader knows that I'm studying the electrosensor in a shark, which is called the ampulla of Lorenzini, I don't keep repeating that. I just say the organ. And people know I'm not talking about an eye because they've read past sentence 1 at that point. Also, parentheses are super useful. We can share that language if it feels important enough. But parentheses are great communicators to an audience that you're showing them kind of into the hood, under the hood. This is how the engine works, but you don't need to know every detail of it, and we can close it again, etc. And it's a verb. You can parenthesize. You can go in and parenthesize some of your writing. Okay, there's a lot deeper dive on this stuff in the book and things we can do. But this gets me up to story number 2. I was a physicist transitioning into studying some biophysics. I was at one of my first biology-focused conferences. It was actually in something called neuroethology, a big workshop at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I had published a high-profile paper. Just sharks get extra attention. They're charismatic. Megafauna is the jargon there, right? So that got sort of high profile, and I'd run across some neuroscientists and biologists who were unhappy with the work and the way I had framed things. They had written a challenge to the journal that had been rejected after numerous back and forth. And then they recruited more. I called them the super friends of neuroscience. So they had like 12 prominent neuroscientists that came together to challenge it again. And I saw one of these people at at this conference and just went up and said, oh, this is a great opportunity. I'll just introduce myself, said, hi, I'm Brandon. I appreciate your interest in my work. And the person waved his dry conference sandwich at me and just said, I'm so sorry, Brandon, I haven't read your work. And I'm like, well, but you signed on to this thing. He's like, I just trust so-and-so. I just trust this person who's kind of organizing the resistance to your ideas. And I said, well, please read my reply at least, or whatever. And I was much younger and so like fired up about this. I wasn't particularly vulnerable, let's say. I had tenure, I was grant funded. Some of us get a lot worse than a sandwich wave and are in more vulnerable situations in terms of social identity, et cetera, in our silos. So it's not an oh, poor me. And now that I've sat with it, I've benefited from this kind of stuff more than I've been hurt by it. Even for this communications book I'm here talking about today, I got an email from a theorist colleague who said, oh, I got this interesting book on my desk from you, from the publisher. What do you want me to say about it? And I'm like, please try to spend some time with it and give them an honest assessment. But let's talk about what might be at play here. I've told students about this with names similarly redacted, like this is bad scientific behavior, but it's very primate-y behavior. It's very monkeys, apes, human stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about the social brain hypothesis. When I was starting this book on brains versus physics, I wanted to see what do people think the human brain really evolved for, and what's the evidence, right? Why can we come up with quarks and gluons and the double helix and how that works, although we're always updating these things, of course. One of the only people, I really like the writing of 't Hooft, and in his On Fundamental Building Blocks book from the late 90s, I think a lot of us take this idea to heart, even if we don't think about it very consciously. And I think it's a little self-congratulatory for us as scientists that the brain's best life is to solve problems, like we do in science. But we have a big brain because we needed sharper tools, better mortars and pestles, et cetera. Right? Does that make sense? I think this is a familiar way of thinking. That's actually called the ecological model of brain development. Big brains for tools and finding food. It turns out mammals, per time spent and energy unit used in finding food, are not very great. We're not special as mammals go. But it turns out if you watch primates, they spend a ton of time not necessarily resting or looking for food. They spend a lot of times picking fleas off of each other, grooming one another, literally, and it's sort of a social bonding thing. I got to visit the Duke Lemur Center kind of randomly, but it was really wonderful to spend time. They have 80 acres dedicated to letting these animals from Madagascar just kind of run things the way they want. And it was fascinating to watch these so-called lower primates. So do we have big brains for tools? Or the social brain hypothesis would say, as we needed bigger social units, there's a lot of complexity with that. And the reason you wake up at 3 in the morning is not worrying about some flow valve you might have left open, but it's often about the email you have to write, or the reviewer number 3 and how you're going to respond to them. It's the very social part of our scientific work, maybe. So this comes from Robin Dunbar, and a really fun part for me in the book is I get to interview Robin Dunbar many times, and he's funny and sort of a good quote, and he's in the book several times. But one of the things Robin Dunbar first did is take a big spread of primates and look at their average social group size. And then on the horizontal axis, look at the size of the relative volume, like a percentage of volume of the neocortex compared to the rest of the brain. And the neocortex is sort of mainly this outer layer, and all we need, as physicists say, is it's doing a lot of perception and reasoning, a lot of the conscious thinking roiling that we have to do as human beings. And if you plot this, and I'm talking to fellow physicists, I know, yeah, log-log plots can often have a correlation, but there's a statistically significant spray of, as primates gather in larger and larger groups, they needed more processing power to worry about, well, who's getting the ripe fruit, who's getting closer to whom, where do I fit within this hierarchy? If I offend this ape, is that going to make that ape mad? Isn't it going to be bad for me, etc.? Then you could get into sort of theories of mind, second order, third order, etc. They just threw humans onto this graph based on the neocortex volume size, but that would, according to this line, say that humans need to be at about group size of 148. You may have heard this as the monkey sphere number or Dunbar's number. And some people like to cite evidence that we can form pretty good social bonds to about that number of people, or that's what our wiring is meant to encompass. And, think about that next time you get on social media and realize, in my case, that half your links are to greyhounds around the world and following their accounts. It's kind of sad. Dunbar often references these sort of social spheres. I find this super, super useful when talking to friends and relatives about things like politics. And we all ask, how can someone believe this? And we may even believe that physically. How can these people set evidence aside seemingly, or set aside evidence they don't want? And it's often you can describe that by, well, what does their inner sanctum say? What would their group of 150 want them to believe? And boy, that is often what a primate will believe. So as you get more and more into this inner sanctum, the social ties get more and more important, and people are willing to do more and more mental backflips to align with the beliefs of that group, okay? But anyway, that's just a tiny primer to the social brain hypothesis. The closely related gossip theory of language is really fun too. People have very different ideas about why we develop language. Gossip theory of language would say at some point when you develop a big enough group size, you just can't pick enough fleas one by one off of other primates quickly enough, and talking really allowed people to accomplish these larger groups. Okay, but let's make it more useful. What does it mean for communications? So we want to focus on, more than ever, on an audience. And I think that is the best lesson from anyone who's taken a writing workshop. Again, where is your reader? What do they care about? We come to so many scientific tasks saying, here's what I really want to tell my audience when we're communicating. I really want to tell them about this. And kind of trying to put that in the background at first and saying, well, what does my audience care about? What are they skeptical about? What questions are they arriving with? What do they hope that I'm going to reference in this paper, etc. Now, I think the hard thing for us to honor is if we really consider primate to primate social brain stuff. It unfortunately, and boy, the literature on this really supports it, as many of you know. When you separate the identity of the writer from a research paper, you get statistically different reviewing results. People are biased based on the institution someone comes from, whether their name sounds male or female, etc. So we do elevate messenger identity and allegiances. One thing that I want to mention that can be helpful, when the first time this book went out for review with MIT, a reviewer wisely said, I think you should really drill down on subfield to subfield differences, right? How does a biologist write and talk versus a physicist? A lot of interesting linguistic data on that, so there's a whole chapter exploring it. But one thing biologists do much more often than physicists is share a little bit of their story. Like, why are they interested in that salamander? What got them into that? And in physics, we're so often, trying to get to the first big idea we're excited about. There's not as much messenger identifying anyway. It's why I shared two personal stories today, just as like an experiment with that idea. And it's not the idea to give like 10 minutes of your talk about personal story, but maybe just an anecdote, why you're studying what you're studying, why you ended up on the problem you did. It may help the audience find the messenger identity in that. No, we cannot do that in a research paper, I realize. But it does, unfortunately, downgrade the weight of data a little bit if we take the social brain seriously. Laura Helmuth was in the science communication program. I mean, she's a pal. I really like how I asked Laura for the book. I said, if you're talking with a scientist about sharing their stories, what is your primary advice? And it really resonates with the social brain hypothesis. You know, just be a human being, share the parts of the experiences. Audiences often really, really connect with that. So if you are doing an interview beyond your silo, or even considering something interdisciplinary and talking to people at a meeting, sharing some of the human side of that can be super, super effective to building trust with an audience, even while it is a little uncomfortable sometimes. Okay, this is a social brain bonus I've added, and it really comes from my time when I was associate dean and my work sometimes as department chair. I think pronouns trip our brains into different paths. When we see first and second person pronouns, I think we're automatically engaging with a very sensitive part of the primate brain. Okay, and we often find ourselves giving feedback with these pronouns. Like, well, I found your talk overall confusing. And if we do this in group settings, my contention would be when you set up that first and second person part of otherwise valid, great, constructive feedback, we have this primate dynamic going on where people are like, oh, well, what side am I on? Is this going to be a long-lasting conflict, etc.? And if we focus on the work as an artifact and take the first and second person pronouns out, it can often kind of lower the temperature and be more productive. The so-called collective we is very powerful here. We're working on this together. We want the paper to be better. This could sharpen the paper together, right? So I think some of you who have been parents know, focus on the behavior, if you will, and not the person when giving feedback. It can do us a lot of good in our scientific collaborations as well. Okay, last little bit, and then we have time for Q&A. Conveyance, giving talks. I got to interview a delightful person. He's degrees in engineering and design. He's done some research as an engineer, but he's now a professional data storyteller with all kinds of big national corporate and government clients. And I said, RJ, what is the one mistake you think academics make when they're giving a talk? And he said, well, they really focus on their slide design, and their slides can be, I just love this phrase, a record of knowledge, right? Instead of thinking like, what would help them tell their story to a live audience? So it's kind of this idea of a performative slide design versus a record of knowledge. Now, I don't know about your subfields. Out in the tech world, especially in biotech, now decks are kind of documents, and sometimes they need to be records of knowledge, but if you're actually giving a talk, you know, the idea is to have slides support you as a speaker and not vice versa, so that you're not to have you worshiping at the altar of your slides. And we'll talk a little bit about, just a bit about the design. This is new. My wife, Dana, retired recently. We put together a big party for her 39 years as a molecular biologist. And she got to do the slideshow, and it just caught me right away. And it was like, wait, what are these images? And she's like, well, in the 80s, when I started, and this is maybe Bodo. We have a friend of mine here from HHMI. But this is the tubey thing on the left is actually a DNA helix twisting around there. And that's a dimer that actually, protein that bonds and can actually twist the DNA a little bit. There's some biophysics going on. On the right, it's a kind of a version of that was showing the binding spots of the dimer to the longer organic molecule. And Dana says, yeah, this one was on our first Macintosh, which had some unbelievably terrible RAM, and it kept, just that graphic kept crashing the computer, right? But anyway, we're off to the races with now we have such firepower for our slides, whereas in this one on the left, she's showing me slides where before we had any computer-enhanced design, they were literally, and some of you may remember this, and I remember it a little bit from my high school days, you would peel some letters off of a big sheet of sticky letters and like put them on a slide or something to take a photo of. So the words were precious and you considered them very carefully. And I just thought that the design and the communication pieces that I was seeing from the 80s were kind of fantastic. Anyway, I'm not a Luddite, but think carefully about what you're presenting to someone there. So I'm advocating for simplicity. We joke in the book about good flag design, but slides are often seen as at a great distance. We're tempted to put in what I would call a visual playpen, but the more intelligent your audience is, the more they're going to be running around. If you've got 5 data plots up there, they're going to create their own narrative or find something they're interested in, which may be completely different than the point you would like to make. RJ likes to have, he gives good talks with like 200 slides, but each of them is just an incremental advancement on what came before. Even if he's quoting someone, the quote will be broken up into many slides. There's a great example. iBiology is kind of a warehouse for public teaching talks. You can take a lot of information out of this without getting bogged down, right? Versus what we might be more used to, name withheld, right? We see a ton of diagrams like this. And I've worked with people, different scientists, we need diagrams like this, but the point can be bring them out piecemeal so you keep the audience's attention more or less where you want it. Maybe just part of the left-hand graph before then part by part of the right-hand graph, etc. Sometimes we have to build these things up, but just simply bringing them out piece by piece can be useful. Like I tried to set the stage even for that simple primate social group size versus relative neocortex brain volume. I just kind of brought that out a piece at a time to kind of workshop that. All right, closing communication thoughts. We're almost wrapped up here. I just love Francine Pro's basically advocating for compassion at the core. You just trying to put yourself in the shoes of your audience as much as possible. We definitely have different amounts of sympathy for that task and different skill sets for it, but it's super helpful. And if you can just give the talk even, or have a friend look at some key piece of a paper, read something aloud, it really helps you move towards this compassionate spot of communication. Ted mentioned what I'm doing next, and I am immersed in this. The class has been a ton of fun, so I do think I'll learn more next week about how the book proposal and the early chapters are going, but there is going to be this sort of biophysics talk of all these animals that view their environments without photons. And this is a bat. You're aware of echolocation, but there's so much amazing biophysics going on there. The thing on the other side you might be less aware of, that's a black ghost knifefish, an animal from the Amazon basin, which uses electric fields, much like the bat does sound, to kind of ping its local environment at different frequencies, measuring capacitance and resistance and kind of mapping out whether it's something to eat or a predator or a plant or a rock, etc. So it can see in a totally murky, dark stream. All right, I welcome communication. Those are the books Ted mentioned. I am not a for-profit author. I'm a not-for-profit author, and I welcome hearing from you. Thanks so much. I don't know.
I have a question about something you said at the end reminded me of books that I read a long time ago by a guy named Edward Tufte.
Oh, yeah.
Mainly about visual display information. I thought that when you were showing your noisy slides. Did your looking at communication and writing intersect at all with the visual aspect? And if so, how?
More the chapter on giving talks, which also a reviewer wanted, and that became one of the biggest chapters, actually. I don't think I referenced Tufte directly, but I'm really aware of that. What does overlap with Tufte is, again, some of these principles of basic flag design that he would appreciate, and just keeping visuals and slides in particular somewhat simple. I like to say if you have a data plot, it's worth the audience's time. It may well be worth its own slide. If not its own slide, then its own time in the limelight. But no, in terms of Tufte, you all gets into some really creative and beautiful, off our normal axis ways of thinking about data to maximize the amount of coherent information in a plot. I won't go into examples. He has some delightful books. There's someone who's monetized. I shouldn't do this in a recording. Anyway, he's very savvy about marketing those workshops, let's say, and good for Edwin. Yeah.
When you give a presentation, in some sense, there are two texts. I mean, there's the one you speak and the one you put on slide.
Yes.
Do you think deliberately about that, about how they work together, or how you might take a different approach, a different style for one versus the other?
I do. That's a great point. If you couldn't hear that, there's sort of the two narratives of a talk: what you're going to be saying and what you're going to be showing. And how intentionally do you think about those two different narratives? I do, and one of my favorite biophysics talks made me think about that anew. It was one of my favorite talks I've seen by the person who first discovered that sharks can hunt with electric fields. They've passed away just a couple of years ago. But Adrianus Kalman gave a talk, and he just spoke to us in a forum a lot like this for about 30 minutes and super compellingly, and then used a couple of graphics. And it wasn't sort of, you may have seen some of our colleagues in the humanities like, okay, it's a conference, I read a paper. It wasn't like that. And I'm throwing no shade, just different silos, right? But Kalman just spoke to us for quite a while and then had a couple of graphics. And I think that's the first time I'd really thought about how different that can be. But absolutely, if I'm at a biophysics conference, instead of a talk like this, I'm definitely trying to have one set of data, since I'm an experimentalist, kind of push the next. And it's literally data driving the narrative. Yeah. So it does vary a lot with audience, for sure. But I do try to make times where it's not just visuals that I'm serving with speech. I try to make little pockets where there's just me hopefully connecting with some folks in the audience, if that makes sense. So these at least little islands of non-visual time. I think that was after especially that Kalman talk, now that I think about it. Yeah. Sure.
There is a very talented particle physicist I know who has a stuttering problem, and so make sure that everything he wants you to get is written down on the slides. I also, with students who get very nervous in front of audiences, if you have everything written on the slide, and even if you get tongue-tied, you could just point to the words and proceed. I wonder how that fits into your pantheon presentation.
Right, great question. So in that case, and I get to teach some communication stuff for our science students on occasion. And some of them are incredibly nervous or have a lot of anxiety. If you could make them all teach for 26 years, right, it gets a little more comfortable. But I am a fan of note cards. I definitely let people read stuff off. Now all these programs also have speaker's notes functions, which are great, so it doesn't necessarily need to be on the slide. And if you need a lot of text on the slide to be comfortable, then I am a fan of just kind of, if it's not too tedious for experienced audiences, bringing it out a chunk at a time, or not just not having a wall of text to greet. Again, an intelligent audience is just going to be kind of off to the races, and you may be saying a lot more than what's on that slide. So that would be my first take. Great question. Yes.
So going back to the part that you mentioned, that personal story or any kind of emotion kind of like brings the reader closer to the scientific advancement, especially for people who are non-scientists. So I have a question about that because I am a writer, but I am not a scientist. And often when I find these personal stories that are part of the scientific accomplishment, I like to include them because I get what you're saying, it brings the reader closer. However, when I send the draft to the researcher, it will come back to me with no emotions, no personal experience, nothing like that.
Right.
So what argument would you make or would convince you as a scientist to allow the writer to bring that personal element to the story?
Great question. And I totally sympathize with that response on your side and definitely the scientist's side. You can really tell them, you could say, unfortunately for better or worse, look around you. If you watch a news story, they're filled with what the people in the business call an anecdotal lead, right? Story that affects, unfortunately, many people in the mountains of North Carolina right now will focus on, look at what this one person experienced and how they managed to get around it and what they've lost, et cetera. Because the data is overwhelming that people connect strongly with a one-person story before they understand if they ever understand the big statistics of a story. So you can explain that it's baked into the practice, and it's based on, it really is supported by a lot of cognitive science, and is really gonna help get their story out there. And they've spent the time to talk to you, to be interviewed, to let their story get a little extra air. And it's not dumbing it down, it's not softening the science at all. It's just helping more people connect to it, human to human. But they may still say, absolutely not, I know. I think there was a hand over here, yes?
Yes, I was raised on the Bible of Strunk and White, which
Nice.
had a fair amount of overlap with your thing.
Sure.
I haven't looked at it in years, but what's your view on Strunk and White these days?
I still love Strunk and White. In fact, I was never happier with a review of this silly book I'm talking about than someone said maybe it's a Strunk and White for a scientific crowd. But that's the thing. I'm really trying to activate some advice for the unique challenges we face. But no, that Strunk and White, if some of you have not seen it, it is a beautifully condensed set of principles to consider when writing and editing, and it feels every bit as relevant today. And I wouldn't be surprised, I haven't tried this yet, like asking a large language model to, why don't you put this through a Strunk and White type edit? They're getting pretty savvy. I might try that almost as soon as I get to the hotel. Yeah, that's a great mention, thank you. Maybe one more question. I know people might have other places to be, Bodo, and then we'll try it back. Yeah.
So I want to come back to your story that must have been painful, where your work was attacked by a group of scientists, and you found out one of them wasn't actually reading.
Yeah, at least one of them wasn't actually reading my work, yeah.
Yeah, and so my question is around whether it is useful to publish critiques, be open with critiques. Obviously, it creates this potential havoc that a text could be getting more personal. But at the same time, I also see from your talk that there are mechanisms to frame criticism in a more, collaborative way. You had some examples of using passive and we.
Yes.
And and in some ways, if it was open, then it could actually help everybody. But then we still need to avoid this these pitfalls of personal attacks.
Yeah,
How do you see the navigating this?
sure. I've seen more and more calls for civil referee reports. And as you know, right, there's some journals where referees have options of being public and identifying themselves. And I'll just mention, in this case, the journal circumvented their own rules because of the standing of the original neuroscientist. My goofy data was upheld, by the way. I just want to include that in the story. Not that it matters that much. But they required, before you could write a challenge to a published set of data or an article, you needed to contact the primary author. And they let the person skirt by that. And it would have been incredibly productive if we could have had just an honest, open conversation. So that was already in place, and they didn't hold by their own rules. But I'm a big fan of public sharing of feedback. Yeah, it was a great, and I thought they required it. Yeah. Thanks for your patience back. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, great talk, thank you.
Welcome.
I was just thinking a lot about how, like, I love the idea of making all writing more accessible, including, the highly scientific research papers. But then especially when you're a younger career scientist, and especially if you're from underrepresented groups, you have a tendency to use overly technical language to try to prove yourself. So I was wondering if you had any ideas for like balancing the being accessible, but also like trying to prove that you know what you're talking about. So at least your internal field.
Sure. I would almost answer that. I don't want it to sound cynical, but these merit badges, this belonging that you're mentioning, using the language in an expert and appropriate way, I might ramp down on that over time.
Yeah.
Right? And I think my first conference talks, you can still give a great talk, I think, with a lot of expert language. So use that, show that expertise, absolutely. But then when you're getting your first chance to be first author and really try to mold a manuscript, it really, according to the data, it's gonna have a little more impact and get a few more pairs of eyes on it if it's more readable. And put that abstract into something like SMOG and see what number comes out and see if there are ways of simplifying it. Yeah, so I would actually, I'm kind of thinking one way in speaking earlier in your career, and then when you really get a chance to start improving manuscripts, being more aggressive about it. Thanks, everybody. Oh, yeah, Ted.
Can I ask one last
Please, yeah.
about the effort of actually writing a scientific paper and how many drafts. I imagine some people can just do exactly the right thing the first time, but I find I write like 5 drafts of my paper, but most people I know just don't take the time to do
Right.
that. So should it take me 5 drafts, or should I be doing something better the first time to avoid having to write 5 drafts?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. So I'm a big believer in what a writer named Anne Lamott calls shitty first drafts. Just get something out there and edit several times. That's where I think the real writing is. I would say you're not doing anything wrong. And when we try to torture ourselves on a really good early first draft, I think there's still often within sigma of what we would have done quickly. And it's the thinking about editing that can greatly improve a text.
Well, that's a big tip, though. I probably tried too hard on my first draft.
Maybe.
Personally, I think I waste time.
Oh, I'm like that. I just love the process. So I spend too long on my first drafts, I think, and then really, really change things. All right, thanks everybody, and thanks for the questions. Appreciate it.